Welcome back. This is Messari's Unqualified Opinions. I am Ryan Selkis at 2-Bit Idiots and got a really exciting interview. We're going to talk a bit about what's going on with the project to the extent that Muneeb can. So we're going to start with a high level of what the project is and where things are going. And I'm sure there's going to be a ton of folks online that have questions about stacks and the tokens. But I don't know how much of that we're going to get into. I'm going to riff with Muneeb on what we can and cannot talk about because we live in the good old US of A. And not only that, but we live in New York, so we got the bit license to worry about too. So want to be sensitive to that, but I think it's going to be a really fun conversation and with someone that has been at the cutting edge of the decentralization movement since 2013, full-time and even earlier outside of that. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Muneeb. Muneeb, why don't we start by talking a little bit about the evolution of Blockstack, which didn't start as Blockstack, but one name, when you were working on the foundational pieces of a decentralized internet and starting with this decentralized name server. So let's talk about the traditional internet infrastructure stack and why you guys went that direction and experimented early on with Namecoin, I believe at the time, and just how you fell down this rabbit hole.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I'm really excited to be here. Hi everyone, Muneeb from Blockstack, and I think it might make sense to actually first go into a little bit into my background. So I did a PhD in computer science from Princeton University. In distributed systems. So our research community, we mostly specialize in building like large-scale computer networks, internet protocols, data centers, cloud computing. That's the kind of world that was coming from. And this is like back in 2013. And the project really started at the computer science department at Princeton. And we were looking at what are the infrastructure problems with the internet. Like imagine like there are certain things that would have been really nice to have at the internet infrastructure level, but we never really had them. Like imagine internet as like a great like skyscraper that was left unfinished by the founding fathers, right? So and then companies like Facebook or Google came in and built those services for people, but in a very centralized way, right? And that's the kind of thing. And obviously, it's a very ambitious task. If you're trying to go in either evolve the internet or in certain extreme cases like build the entirely new network and hope that people can like migrate over. So it's a very ambitious project, pretty much like in the R&D stages for a very long time, but that's something that we feel very comfortable in. So some of the early people that we hired, they're all computer scientists, mostly from Princeton, then from Stanford and MIT. And in the early days, what we were thinking is the one name service that you mentioned, we were thinking that this can't be just R&D on the infrastructure. We need to build some sort of a real service on top to get real traction on the platform, to learn while we are doing some of the core R&D work as well. So you should think of one name as kind of like a registrar service, like almost like a GoDaddy that was registering your username or you can think of as a domain name on this alternative universe. Right? So that was like pretty exciting. People were claiming their usernames, going through our registrar, and registering themselves really on this like truly decentralized internet. And we ran the service for a while and realized that it is actually much better if people are able to download client software themselves and be fully in control of any assets like these usernames that they are registering on the network instead of going through a third-party service. Right? So
and let's drill down on that because maybe it would have been fair to introduce you as one of the co-stars of Silicon Valley in this last season. Right? I wonder, and I think it's a fair skeptical critique of some of the work that the folks, including yourself, are doing. Is this a solution in search of a problem? Like let's drill down on the actual pain point because you mentioned the skyscraper example. It's like the founding fathers forgot to actually include the sidings of the skyscraper. I wonder how much that's true versus the need just didn't appear to be acute at the time, and the internet scaled as it did because it was an emergent system, and now there is an opportunity maybe, but only if there is truly an acute pain point that this further decentralization effort is aiming to solve. So, so where do you see that pain point right now? And let's get a little bit more granular with what the problem is with the incumbents, because I feel like it's starting to get on people's minds, but the default is still, I just want to use this application.
Sure, right? Absolutely. So I think I would say that there is actually a really big pain point, but a smaller subset of people were feeling it initially, and that circle is just growing and growing and growing and growing, right? Let me give you some concrete examples. So imagine like Larry Page or Sergey at Stanford back in the 90s. They wanted to go and crawl the internet, so they could actually like write a web crawler, download all of the data that they wanted to, and basically analyze it, innovate on top of it, come up with a better search algorithm, and make Google. Fast forward to 2 decades later, it's like me and Ryan at Princeton, and we want to like innovate. Like we were really interested in doing something interesting things with the social graph, and we tried getting that data out of Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, and these companies wouldn't even let you. Like sometimes explicitly through their terms of service, or they would ban you, they would block you. So basically, what's happening is that certain information that should be available to any developer, so that that developer can innovate on top of it, was no longer available to developers unless you work at a Facebook or a Google, right? So in a way, we as developers were feeling that pain point. And again, I'm saying that initially that subset was very small. It would be the company like, it's funny, we are in Periscope right now, right? And there was a company called Meerkat that was exploding in terms of popularity. Twitter shut down access to Meerkat and then acquired Periscope. In a decentralized world, that's not possible.
In short order.
In very short order, right? And in a decentralized world, like there should be competition. Like you would, you have like antitrust laws against like some of these things that are not very effective in the technology space right now. Through many definitions, like these large companies are effectively monopolies. They can do whatever they want. And when we saw what happened with the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, where it has so much power over, even opinions people would have during an election. So that circle of pain, I would say, has been visibly growing, and there's seems to be no end in sight. Like every time, let's say Patreon deplatforms somebody, that hey, you cannot use my platform anymore. The reaction is that can there be an alternative where no company can actually just like censor somebody or tell them that hey, you can't earn a living because of whatever activities that you participate in. That initially sounds like this is just some extreme. It's actually not an extreme case, because if you think about it, if you think about the real world, imagine your house, right? You own it. You own all the property inside it, right? If you're having a conversation in your living room, imagine you don't have Alexa or anything like that. You can be fairly certain that it's just a conversation between 2 people. The online world should work closer to how the real world works. But just the way things evolved, we ended up almost like always operating in a world controlled by a Google or a Facebook, where we don't own anything, where we never have guarantee of privacy, and it impacts people, right? Like, and that impact, it just keeps growing and growing, and we just happen to be in this space at the right time, where we have seen the evolution, right? So we started focusing a lot more on our infrastructure and actually enabling developers to build on top. And now there are, I think, more than 70 independent teams or startups that are building all these different use cases. Like,
we'll get into the use cases in a second, but maybe just to summarize that, it seems like there's 2 kind of core problems that people are starting to recognize. One is this deplatforming, right? And at the total logical extreme, it's the Black Mirror episode where the person gets unpersoned, right? And you just see the blurry person walking out of the room, and is now disconnected from society, which is essentially the digital equivalent of what's happening on Patreon and some of these other platforms. And we won't go into the specific cases, but just the fact that can happen, I think many people would agree is a concern. Then there's the derivative elements, which Albert Wenger, one of your investors, has written about. I don't know if he calls it the personal API or the open API, but it basically speaks to the fact that even if you wanted to leave these platforms voluntarily because you didn't agree, right? In crypto, you'd fork, right? Exit the network. You can't feasibly do that without just leaving your entire digital network behind, right? And so one of the things that might be, you've got the folks that are being censored, which is the exception, not the rule.
Yep.
And then you've got maybe the folks that can see this in the not too distant future and want to voluntarily start dabbling with other more open systems that are going to be a little bit more private. How do you guys tackle that second thesis, which is, in many cases, it's like the early Bitcoin community all over again. The early Bitcoin community was the dollar's not going to end well, right? We're printing money. It's like the gold bug and libertarian crowd, the Austrian economic crowd. This movement and groundswell to own your own data and at least have the ability to exit these digital platforms seems to be the information equivalent, and that's really where Blockstack is.
Absolutely. So I think Balaji has a great phrase, like he calls it the freedom to exit, and people have exercised that freedom even in terms of migration. Like if you don't like the kind of like the government of the country you're born into, people exit. People migrate. People go to other jurisdictions where there are more or better opportunities available. And this has been going on forever. And I think there is a digital equivalent of freedom to exit, and that's exactly what you're describing. That right now it doesn't really exist. Like it is so painful for you to kind of like delete your Facebook profile, download everything else, and there's no alternative available. Where would you even take that data, even if you could get it? But if you truly have this freedom to exit, even with you brought up Bitcoin, it's even in a way different from forking. It's just the fact that you can take your Bitcoins out of Coinbase, take it to any other exchange that you want. Even that freedom, I would argue, this is enough to put pressure on a provider to play nice. Because if they really start like messing it up, users would just exit, and there are other options available where they can go to. Now I'm trying to think of a service provider like Facebook as a Coinbase, where users could very easily exit, take their data, and it just works equally well, just like you take your Bitcoin out of Coinbase and go somewhere else.
And do you think that's feasible? Is it going to require this kind of brave new world of pioneers that say, I'm sick of Facebook, I'm sick of Twitter, I'm sick of all the incumbents, and I just want to start something from scratch? And do you need that community to emerge first before you can start siphoning off others, or can you work collaboratively with some of these larger platforms, particularly in light of the fact that a lot of them are under fire, right? Zuckerberg has come out with this manifesto of we're going to decentralize, and you can be skeptical of that, and I'm sure you guys probably are, and I certainly am. But how do you think about just pushing on those incumbents because they have just such a massive user base and seeding something from the ground up, which is one of the tacks that you've taken with Blockstack?
Absolutely. So I think our vision there is that obviously the kind of like R&D and infrastructure phase needs to happen first, and we might be at the tail end of it, especially at Blockstack. And then we are focusing a lot more on developers. So think of this as developers. They're the folks who build work, and there are very few of them in crypto right now. And as far as large players are concerned, out of all the conversations I've had, Facebook is obviously taking this extremely seriously now, and it's a good sign, right? Like if they enter, it's a real market. Other large players would have to enter as well. From what I've seen in the industry, everyone who's not a Google or a Facebook is very interested in this shift from cloud computing to decentralized computing because they have nothing to lose, right? They already don't have the user data that they monetize. Their business models are not tied to user data. So other large tech companies are very interested. It's almost like the enemy of your enemy is your friend. They already don't monetize user data, and they're very open to a world where they continue to not have user data, but also their competitors don't have the user data. And out of the companies that have user data, I think Facebook is by far the biggest one that gets all the heat, because of certain incidents that have happened, or or how they've been in the spotlight for not handling user data and a certain rights level, and they're taking it extremely seriously.
So the second half of that question, you mentioned the 70 or so projects or developers, folks that are building on top of the core infrastructure that you've built. Walk us through the Blockstack and where your core team is spending most of its time versus where you're trying to incentivize community members to build on top. Yep. What are the core components?
Absolutely. So I think you should really think of this project as we raised venture capital. So you mentioned Albert Wenger, Union Square Ventures, led our seed round and our Series A, and also participated in the token offering. But the way we have taken our approach has mostly been, let's figure out the hard computer science problems first, right? Problems like scalability, problems like security. Let's take what we have done to the real experts, like the distributed systems research community, and get peer reviews, publish this at conferences. And when we feel that this is ready enough, the infrastructure, let's start getting developers on top, right? So the first, I would say, even the 4 years of the project were pretty much like hardcore R&D, other than some services built on top. And then probably last year, developers really started getting into using the platform. And there are so many moving pieces. Like, imagine a full stack decentralized computing platform that gives you everything you need to quickly build decentralized applications. So just over, I would say, the last 2 quarters, like in Q4 last year and Q1 of this year, apps published on the platform have been doubling quarter over quarter. And that's because of all the hard work that the team did in times before that. So as far as like Blockstack PBC, so I'm the CEO of Blockstack PBC, which is a structure that's a public benefit corp, and we have just 2 things that we focus on. One is the core protocols and developer tools. So we have a lot of research scientists, we have a lot of engineers, we're building the core platform and the developer tools. And the second thing is, and this is something I never thought in my life that I'd be doing, we focus on all the compliance and regulations. Right? So imagine that we're creating an ecosystem of many independent entities. The entity that I run is responsible for the core technology, but at the same time, all of the compliance and regulations and whatever else we need to do, and that's the part where as you mentioned already, that I can't comment much.
Sure. Well, I'm going to try to get you to comment at least a little bit in macro, maybe not specifically on your particular case. But just to be very clear, so people just talk about dApps as they're just this magical thing that falls from the sky, and they're better because they're decentralized. The core components, you need the computation, the virtual machine. You need storage. You need the namespace, which is where you guys have historically focused. What else is required to complete that puzzle?
Let me walk you through the stack. So I think we have boiled it down to 3 things. There are other things, but let's focus on just 3. The first thing is an authentication protocol. Right? So imagine if you're a developer, you're building a new app, you either have to create usernames and passwords, or you would use something like Facebook Connect or Google Sign In. And instead of using those options, like in one case, you're keeping all of the user data on a database. Right? So your usernames and password, or you're using Facebook or Google to do the same thing. We have a decentralized auth protocol. You just drop it in as a JavaScript library. It works almost like how Facebook Connect works. It's fully decentralized, and that's where the initial work that we did, where users have their kind of universal usernames, comes in. Everyone who has that username can basically just, with one click, use any application. Right? So you don't have to create a new account every time you want to use a new application, and you also don't have to worry about data traces. Like, you're not like making a new account and then that website now knows something about you. You're downloading an app, trying it out locally with a single click. You don't like it, just delete the app, and there's no data trace of anything. The second layer is the data storage layer. It's called Gaia, and it's very important, and we have spent a lot of our R&D on it. And let me explain why. I think I might have been tweeting about this literally this morning, where I think that the entire crypto industry or the decentralized projects, they've kind of like picked one path, mostly led by Ethereum, and they're just like going down deeper and deeper into that path. right? And if you look at that path is literally like put all the complexity on a blockchain. The blockchain stores most of the data. The blockchain has like a smart contracting system that runs all of the computations, and everything is a smart contract, right? So I view this as a very, very complex network, and our approach is almost like the exact opposite of it, right? So the data storage there is completely separate from the blockchain. You're not supposed to store like any large amounts of data at the blockchain at all, and even with the storage system, we are not taking the approach of like, with most projects, they are trying to build like peer-to-peer systems, meaning that I keep some of my data on your computer or somebody else's computer or some random stranger's computer. If that person like walks away, closes their laptop, that data is no longer available. There's like a rich history of peer-to-peer systems research where these approaches have historically never worked out. We took the approach that so many data centers and cloud storage systems have already been built out. Let's repurpose them in a decentralized way, right? So we wrote this wide area file system that puts encrypted data on existing storage providers. So users would get like their own private data locker, right? And you can choose where you want to keep it, right? And it's basically if you connect your Dropbox, or if you connect your Google Drive, or you put it on we run a storage service as well. You can keep it there, but it's yours. I think in a way it takes you back to the desktop era, where both for our apps, you remember you're downloading the apps and you're installing them locally. Similar to desktop software, you would get it in a CD-ROM, you would install it locally, and then the app is storing data locally with you. Similar in our case, it is storing data with you, with the difference that you are storing data backed by actual cloud storage. In a fully encrypted way though, because Dropbox wouldn't be able to see where the data is stored, and you can use multiple such providers.
And that's where the token comes in, correct?
No, that's the layer beneath. So the third.
So why I wasn't sure if the token was going to be used for that as well. Why have you not focused on securing those lockers wherever they might be,
yeah, absolutely.
And ensure availability, because that's like the Filecoin system.
Yeah, so one difference with Filecoin's approach and our approach is that Filecoin is also trying to incentivize people to connect storage so that they would get incentivized by Filecoin tokens.
Got it.
We're not getting into that at all. Okay. Where we use the token is only for access control. So on the Stacks blockchain, you would register kind of like your key pairs, and only the key pairs who are registered can get access to the data lockers, and that's it. Juan is a friend of mine. He was with me at Y Combinator, and if he cracks that problem, great, we can plug it in, right? But in my view, it's a very, very hard problem to solve, and that's why he's putting a lot of resources behind it. And we are not even touching that problem. Our model is that people would eventually need to pay for their storage, and they already do. There's so many. Dropbox is a public company. There are so many people who already pay Dropbox, and cloud storage. Storage has also historically been a very cheap thing in computing. Like the price of storage drops faster than other components. So there should be plenty of storage available for people to just use it in the appropriate way in decentralized apps.
And so the access control system, the reason for the token is so that you are never the provisioner of last resort.
So that's the third part, and that's the Stacks blockchain. So imagine the Stacks blockchain is, again, our approach is that it's a very light blockchain. We only do minimal things at the blockchain there. We do have smart contracts, which I'll get into that in a little bit, like how our approach is very different for smart contracts as well. But the Stacks blockchain is, in a nutshell, the place where you register digital assets, like usernames, where developers would publish smart contracts, and basically there are some very interesting things we have done on the incentive model, that instead of just having incentives for the core protocol developers, like myself and others like Jude and Aaron, or even like the entities who are kind of like building the core protocols. Basically, we expanded the concept to developers in general, right? So we have this notion of app mining, where apps that get ranked higher would get a portion of the newly minted tokens, and they go to them, right? And we have been running that program in a pilot phase. So imagine in the Apple App Store, Apple decides what to feature, and we are basically decentralizing how apps get ranked. So we have reviewers like Product Hunt or user testing, and are basically adding reviewers who rank apps based on the criteria that we think would be useful for the community. So initially, like the user experience of applications wasn't that great. So we added a reviewer that is explicitly giving them scores on how good the UX is, and the UX of the apps basically started going up. So imagine like having many.
How are people using the apps right now if the stacks are not live?
Those are the.
This is all testnet?
No, it's LiveNet, but we basically came up with this phase we're operating in, where imagine that certain features on our blockchain are turned off because of regulations, but we are kind of like footing the bill for registering users directly on the blockchain. But if you want to burn stacks,
the blockchain
right now,
being
the stacks blockchain.
The stacks blockchain.
So
okay.
if you want to burn, so let me rewind a little bit.
So they're basically using your stacks for free
yes.
during this test phase until you can release to okay.
And because only accredited investors could participate in our 50 million offering in 2017, that's not everyone in the world is an accredited investor, and so they don't have access to the stacks tokens. And this is something that we've been working on for a while.
That's mostly true. There were users that were able to. Were they able to They weren't able to purchase. They were just able to reserve vouchers.
Yes.
Correct.
What we did was that was our 50 million offering in 2017. Again, I think it would be interesting to go a little bit deeper into it. I almost feel like
when you can.
The last one I can talk about, right? The 2017 one. Again, I think like I'm noticing this trend that we end up doing things very differently from the rest of the industry. So when there was this like quote unquote ICO mania happening in 2017, we potentially could have raised a lot more capital. We could have raised it as like, okay, just we have the money and we choose to do whatever we want with it. The way we did it, we were looking very carefully into securities regulations, and we're setting up legal structures that we thought would be compatible with existing securities regulations in the US, and we ended up with these Delaware funds. So investors were basically becoming limited partners in the fund, and then we had this self-imposed investor protection mechanism where in the LP agreement, the limited partner agreement, only 20% of the capital would come out as R&D explicitly. So this is money for Blockstack PBC to do R&D work on the blockchain. If you guys don't do it, and the timelines were very aggressive, it was January of 2019 that has already passed. If we don't build the Stacks blockchain and take it live by January of 2019, the funds would liquidate and the money would go back to the investors. Right? So we were holding ourselves, and it was completely self-imposed. And you can imagine the pressure at our team last year when, yes, we raised 50 million.
So I appreciate it, right? I will always take a skeptical lens to that, though, because you also controlled what the deliverable was to a certain extent, right? Because you could ship it if you had to hit the date, even if it was feature incomplete or if it was a little bit rushed.
No, it was an independent board who would evaluate it. They did evaluate it.
Okay.
And so there was no one from our company on that board.
Got it.
So there were a couple of investors and a couple of independent parties who would then evaluate that did this ship, is the network live with the functionality that they said that it would be live. And literally the board could have decided that no, it's not.
It also would have been against their best interest. I think the structure was it was a great structure, but I think it was a reasonable, fair, and forward-thinking structure. But I think you should earn your 50 million, and most people might think that that's reasonable versus something to be lauded a little bit overboard. But you've done a lot of things right. You've been thoughtful with the approach. You've been thoughtful from a regulatory standpoint, from how this gets managed, how it gets built out. So across the board, I think that a lot of things have gone well and seem to be trending in the right direction. Having said that, there's a totally different approach that you could take to building one of these systems, and that's what Ethereum has done.
Yep.
Which was to play fast and loose, to get things off the ground, to push the envelope, They, from a regulatory standpoint, seem to be in the clear, right?
Yep.
Grandfathered in, you might say, and maybe because they were early, it's now gotten to the point where doing something ex post facto would be too damaging or counterproductive. But from a technical side, you've also weighed in on some of the challenges that there are with Ethereum. So let's talk about Ethereum itself and how you see Blockstack versus Ethereum, or as a complement, and what you have commented on historically regarding Ethereum 2.0, which I think even the core developers will tell you is a brand new blockchain.
Yeah, it is.
Right?
It is.
So, but you've been outspoken and you've actually reviewed some of the research.
Yes, I have it. So let me go back to actually when the first time I saw the Ethereum white paper. Right, I read it, and to be very frank, very honest, I'm wearing my computer scientist hat. Like to me, it sounded like pie in the sky ideas, incredibly complex thing that is probably impossible to build. And when I say probably impossible to build, the reason is that there is a lot of at least prior work that tends to basically point us to the fact that such networks are extremely hard to build. Right? Let me get into why. The first thing is that in distributed systems, there's this principle called the end-to-end design principle. It's very old. It's by this guy David Clark from MIT. He was the chief protocol architect of the internet. He built the internet, right? And the idea is that in large complex networks, you should keep them very simple at the core and have all the complexity at the edges, right? And time again, and this sometimes goes outside of distributed systems as well. And a classic example is there used to be a computer set architecture called the complex instruction set back in the early 80s. And there was the RISC architecture, reduced instruction set architecture. Reduced instruction set basically said, just do a few things, multiplication, addition, and do it really well. And people will build complexity on top of it as needed. Whereas there was a very, very complex microchip, nobody knows about it today. RISC completely took over the market. That's the only thing we use now. Same with the internet, right? There were actually very complex other alternate networks that never took off. And the internet, all it was doing was taking packets from one place and delivering it there, but it was doing a good job at just that one thing. So from that perspective,
The quip for how to describe this is worse is better.
Yeah, it's basically like saying that your core of the network has to be simple, right? And again, like it's a design principle. Sure, maybe someone can come up and crack this problem and build a very complicated thing that ends up working out. But I was extremely skeptical. Not just that, but also the approach of like using a Turing-complete language, effectively allowing remote code execution, which anybody would think that hey, this is a bad idea. Any random developer in the world can write code, you're forced to run it, right? And it's a Turing-complete language, meaning that it can do anything, right? So I've been skeptical of the approach in general, and as you said, that Ethereum took a very different approach. I think they attracted a bigger community. They were very vocal, really good at marketing, right? And Vitalik has a huge following. And the interesting thing is that most people, and I mean that as respectfully as possible, in crypto have no idea, have absolutely no idea what those technical writings and papers mean. Like they could be gibberish and they won't be able to tell the difference.
Well, I mean, even me, if I'm trying to give a skeptical, hard-hitting technical interview, I certainly can't do that, right? So I can push back on some of the high-level things that you say, but one of the things that I think in this market that's fascinating to watch is that everybody has an opinion on Twitter, and you don't necessarily see this with astrophysics. But plenty of people are armchair cryptographers.
Yeah. And so I think
or even worse, right? They basically just put a finger in the air and say, "Oh, this will get figured out."
Exactly. So
that's not how the physics work.
Yeah. Let me give you like a very, very concrete example, right? So sometimes I would end up publicly saying something or being publicly critical or something, and then people would be like, "But what about this? What about here's a proposal?" I'm like, I can't sit there, basically finding flaws in all of these proposals all day, right? Like the best thing I can do is build an alternative that uses a different architecture and just put it out there and see what happens.
But are you still anchoring to Bitcoin?
We are. I'll get into it.
We'll finish the Ethereum.
Finish the Ethereum stuff. But sometimes people would be asking questions and they'd be like, "Can you be more specific?" So a couple of times we have tried being more specific. One such instance was Casper CBC published a research paper, and there was on Twitter people were like, "Look." They were saying that Vitalik and Vlad won't be able to do this research. They just published the research paper. It has all these equations. It proves everything, right? And internally, or in my computer science circles, we would look at it and we would be like, "What is this thing?"
But there's an integral symbol in the white paper, so it looks official.
Yes, right. So we actually went through. Again, I talked to Vlad and Vitalik about this. All due respect to them. It was one of the hardest research papers I've read in my life. I've been doing this for more than 16, 17 years now, right? Doesn't make any sense. We went through the hardship of trying to make sense of what this thing is, and try to imagine that there are concepts in distributed systems called Byzantine fault tolerance, right? BFT, a lot of people talk about it. The paper gets the definition.
Which is basically how do you solve the double spending problem when you don't have some central source of
truth. That's one kind of way in which that problem shows up. But imagine some other field like physics. There's a definition of gravity, right? And some author uses a different definition of gravity. We point that out that this is not the definition of Byzantine fault tolerance. And I think Vlad ended up admitting that yes, I have my own definition. And then there are proofs in it. So the way to explain it is, if I give you a set of things to prove, to say that this is a Byzantine fault tolerant program, and I give you a set of proofs in that paper, there are zero overlap in those two sets. So effectively, the proofs don't prove anything at all, absolutely, right? And you're sitting there, you're looking
apples
at
to oranges.
And we wrote a public review. We tried to make it as polite as possible. We got feedback from a bunch of people, from Vlad and Vitalik as well, and then we ended up publishing it. Obviously, people Ethereum has a very large community, and people don't like to get the view that the folks who are trying to design these protocols might not know what they're doing, right? So I think that's the kind of thing I end up running into.
Yeah, I can't imagine why that might be something that folks push back on. With all due respect, you have no idea what you're doing. That sounds like something I would say, but yeah, I'm sure you said it much more. I'm sure you said it much more politely.
So so I think in general, let's go back to Ethereum 2.0. And again, they're very intelligent people. I think my point is, my advice has always been to the Ethereum community: please engage with the distributed systems research community. It's a very small community. They know each other, right? And I can tell whenever someone from the distributed systems research community engages with crypto. There are very few, handful.
Are most of them still primarily Bitcoin, or are there other projects that have attracted?
Algorand is one team. They're absolutely stellar distributed systems researchers who are working on Algorand. Right? I've known they're known entities in the research circles, and I have a lot of respect for them. And then so they're coming, right? They've been very skeptical of this space in general, but they're slowly, I think they see that, hey, this might be the next thing after cloud computing, and they're turning over. So very quickly about Ethereum 2.0. So going back to hey, it's a complex network, maybe you want to simplify it. Ethereum 2.0 effectively doubles down on it. That we will solve complexity by throwing in more complexity. And it's we are going to kill the Ethereum 1.0 chain. I don't think most Ethereum holders actually realize that this is the plan. And then we're going to start a new chain, and it's going to take between 2 to 5 years. And here are the 5 steps, and 2 of them are missing. Right? If you look at the level of details that are there in terms of what they're going to do, it's basically we will figure it out. Right? And that's where it goes back to is the approach that yes, we will figure it out as we go, maybe better with a large community working at it versus our more professional. We will engage all the experts and make sure that we only proceed once we believe that we actually have a solution.
Well, yeah, and because the other component of it is barring any catastrophic structural failure, right, of the underlying system. There are enough vested interests that will figure it out, right? Inferior technology has won countless times just because it's already had critical mass. So how do you balance that? Because you're talking about orders of magnitude difference between the Ethereum community and Blockstack. I don't even think that Blockstack is probably in the top 5, right? People are building on EOS, people are building on Cosmos now, because I think that there probably is a strong bias towards things that are in production and actually in the wild. How long can you continue to push forward with your existing community before the regulatory holdbacks just completely put you behind the 8 ball?
Sure. So I think the way we look at the ecosystem right now is that we're noticing a lot of applications in decentralized finance, right, where smart contracts are kind of like needed, where transaction volume might not be the bottleneck. Like you're not going to take a loan out 10,000 times a day, or hopefully you wouldn't. Those use cases are working on systems like Ethereum, right? Because transaction volumes are low. They require smart contracts. Yes, Solidity is not the best smart contract language out there, but it works, right? And given it,
and by the way, our team tends to think that, well, I'll speak for myself, but I know others on our team have written about this, that not only is it okay, but it's maybe likely that Ethereum becomes a DeFi blockchain, and then Web3, more data-driven, high throughput applications end up being on some other derivative.
Yeah. So this is exactly the point I was getting at. The developers were building, on our platform, if you look at the Apple App Store, there are categories, right? Like social apps, business apps, security apps, whatever. So decentralized apps and gaming, like gambling effectively, are the main use cases on Ethereum, EOS, Tron, if you consider that real. These
Tron, we have to talk about Tron after you finish this thought.
But if you look at all the other categories, you're actually seeing more traction on Blockstack than on these systems, right? And here's the reason for it. The reason is, if you're building a Twitter on Ethereum, that is implemented as a smart contract where every time there's a transaction and a transaction fee to tweet, nobody is going to use that, right? Whereas our architecture is so different that if you're building a Twitter on top of Blockstack, you don't have to hit the blockchain every time you tweet, right? So that I would say that our architecture is already well suited for more general purpose applications, and we are seeing developer traction in those categories, and we are launching a much more secure smart contracting language shortly.
So you bring up Tron. I love talking about Tron because in these open source environments, you can steal everything, right? So this is not only relevant for Tron, it's also relevant for Ethereum, and kind of the second part of the point, which is as long as there isn't a catastrophic flaw, or as long as the architecture is not so broken that you have to throw the whole system out, you should be able to the core developer should be able to fork in anything from you guys, from Algorand, from Zcash, from whether you're talking about a feature or a subcomponent or maybe even an entire subsystem, provided that you can build this out in a modular fashion. Is that is there some flaw in that thinking, or what happens if will you be able to tell whether the architecture is broken until it just breaks and the whole system crashes? Maybe I'm not articulating it that well, but I think you get what I'm driving at.
I heard multiple questions in there, right? So the first question was, can other people just take something that one project has done and implement it? I think theoretically they can. When it comes to reality, it actually is more of a concept of almost like school of thought, right? Like if you're in one school of thought, you truly believe, there are people who truly believe that sharding is the way to go forward, right? I would not even attempt a solution that touches sharding. There's no way this can work. Absolutely the wrong approach. I'm not doing it, right? The people who believe sharding is going to work are going to assemble together, and they're going to be attracted to the projects that are trying to make sharding work. Like same with like proof of stake, or same with there's an entire community where people are building programs on top of WebAssembly, WASM. That thing, WASM, was designed to make JavaScript faster. That is not the problem you're trying to solve in blockchains. You're trying to have security at the smart contract level, not to make JavaScript faster. But there are people out there who are excited by that approach, and they're going to kind of like hang out together and try and build those systems. If we think that community can just change their mind, can truly become convinced that sharding is a bad idea, or WASM is a bad idea, sure, they can technically change that for something else. But I believe that it's not just about adopting technology. It's more about what's your school of thought, what do you really believe in, and where are you going to end up going.
So we've already gone a little bit longer than I normally do for these, but it's just because you've got the combination of the background in distributed systems and actually can opine on some of these and have been asked to, and then everything that's going on with Blockstack and the fact that it is very under the radar still, just given some of the constraints.
So some of them was planned. We were like heads down, just building stuff.
We're going to have a follow-up conversation when we possibly can about the whole process that you guys are going through and some of the challenges on the non-technical and non-business even side and just the compliance side. But what do the next 3 to 6 months look like from a roadmap perspective? There's probably a couple of things that we have to squiggle out and we can't talk about in terms of where they are on the roadmap. But from what you can talk about, what's success look like for the rest of 2019?
Yeah, so I think we're very excited about the developer traction. I mentioned that apps, like real usable apps with real utility, they've roughly been doubling quarter over quarter in Q4, Q1, and right now think of this way, and I have to like phrase it very carefully, that due to certain regulations, certain features on our platform are effectively turned off. Right? And I cannot comment on the timeline, but it is possible that we are able to turn on these features sometime soon. And when that happens, that means that the full functionality of our full stack computing, including the blockchain layer, including tokens, smart contracts, all of that, is now fully available to folks. And obviously, we're working very hard towards that. Once that happens, I think in terms of the rest of the year, our focus remains on developers. We believe that it's not just the quantity of developers, it's also the quality of developers. Like more professional developers who actually look under the hood. Like if you're a serious startup and you want, or even a serious company, like a large company, and you want to build on top of a platform, you're going to look under the hood. You need to feel comfortable that the underlying platform can actually scale, is actually secure, is run by people who know what they're doing, and I think we are attracting those type of developers, and I would love to see that developer community grow more.
Muneeb, thanks so much for coming on a Friday. I hope everybody enjoyed this one. I always have to, normally I try to tap out after 20 to 30 minutes. This is like a marathon session for me, especially trying to keep up with you when I'm A, not an engineer, and B, I'm seeding a couple dozen IQ points, I think. So I hope that this was a good one to follow, mostly because I'm sure Muneeb bailed me out for any poorly worded questions. But we'll have this up on iTunes next week. We got a lot more coming up next week, both on the technical and the business side from other guests. But in the meantime, you can check out Blockstack and their developer tools if you're thinking about decentralized applications. And of course, you can follow Muneeb on Twitter, where he has his first name handle, @Muneeb, which is a huge win.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. This definitely went on for longer. And one final comment about Ethereum, that any of my views about it are purely about the technology. I really appreciate the Ethereum community. They're one of the early people who kind of like made decentralized computing happen.
How do you feel about Ripple?
You're opening a whole new chapter.
And scene.
Thank you.
Guys, until next week, have a good weekend. Peace.